Okay, it looks like people are still joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and open up the poll. So like we do every week, if you don't mind taking the next 5 minutes to fill out this poll so we have a better idea of who's joining us tonight, it would be much appreciated. Thank you so much. And while everyone is filling out that poll, I did want to make another brief announcement. In the past, for the past 3 webinars, we've usually waited until the very end of the session to do Q&As. Today, our presenter, Dave, will possibly be answering some of the questions during his actual presentation and sort of integrating those answers into his presentation. So again, feel free at any time to submit your questions via the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. The chat should be reserved strictly for technical issues, but the Q&A is where you should submit your questions, and he will get to as many as he can during the presentation that he deems appropriate to the content of what he's going over. And then at the very end, if we have time for questions, we will get to as many as we possibly can. So again, feel free to submit all of your questions in the Q&A. Take a couple more minutes to fill out that poll. All right, and looks like most of you are done. So you know what? Let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you to the final 4th webinar in our GATE mini-series. Tonight's topic is Understanding IQ Testing and Special Programming for Advanced and Gifted Learners. Oops. Here we go. As we do every week, we will be recording this session, and the recording will be available within 24 hours. You will receive an email with a direct link to the recording, but if for some reason you don't, you can access the recording manually, again, 24 hours after we finish up tonight. The website is uci.webex.com. Simply select Event Center, click on View Event Recordings, which is located in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, and you'll be able to access that recording for the next couple of weeks. I will also be sending an email to everyone right after this, or tomorrow, that includes a PDF of the slides and also the handout that Dave is going to be talking about. And actually what I'm going to do is allow all of you to download that one worksheet that I was just referring to. So if you, let's see here. Just give me 1 second. Oops. You should see a box that has jumped up that says to download a file. Either select it and then click download or right click. If you go ahead and just click on that button and push the download button, you should be able to go ahead and download that file. If you have trouble downloading it today, it will be sent as an attachment with the PDF of the slides in my email tomorrow. My name is Amanda Angelmo, and I'm a program representative here at UC Irvine Extension. And again, this is going to be the outline for our presentation, just like every week. I'm going to give a brief overview of our Gifted and Talented Education Certificate program that we have here at UCI, and give a little bit of information on some upcoming courses. We will then move to the panelist presentation, and tonight's topic is Understanding IQ Testing and Special Programming for Advanced and Gifted Learners. That presentation will be delivered by David Palmer, who is a Ph.D. in educational psychologist and director of the Palmer Learning Center in Orange County, California. He's also one of the esteemed instructors in our GATE program here at UC Irvine. As I mentioned before, we will try to answer some of your questions during the presentation, but we will also have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for Q&A. And you can submit those questions at any time in the Q&A feature. At the very end, I'll provide my contact information, so if there are any questions that we didn't get to during the course of the presentation, please feel free to email me those, and I will make sure I can find you the answer. All right, looks like the poll responses are being submitted right now. Thank you so much for filling that out. All right, on to our certificate program overview. Our GATE program consists of 9 quarter units, and students can choose from a number of topics to fulfill the credit requirements. We do offer the Gifted and Talented Education Certification completely online, which allows us to offer it to individuals around the country and also around the world. We are also available on-site at schools and district offices. We can deliver in-services, individual courses, and the full GATE certification program right at your school. The program is designed for 3 specific types of people. The first being individuals who are interested in gifted and talented education theory and practical applications. The second being individuals exploring entry or career transition into GATE instruction. And of course, teachers committed to curricular differentiation for all students. And as I mentioned before, parents are more than welcome to sign up for some of these classes that prove to be, very relevant to the issues that they deal with at home. As I mentioned in the last session, we do have Meeting the Social Emotional Needs of the Gifted and also Identification Programming for the Gifted, which are 2 courses that are very beneficial for parents as well as teachers. The ID and Programming for the Gifted course will actually be taught by Dave Palmer, our presenter tonight. That course begins on June 22nd and runs through July 19th. It is a 1-unit course online, and it is $350. The other course is Meeting the Social Emotional Needs of the Gifted. That is a 2-unit course, $475, and it runs from June 22nd through August 16th. And the final course, the Arts and GATE, is a 2-unit course for $475, and that one will run from July 20th through September 13th. You are able to register for any of these classes today, and if you click on that live link, it will take you right to the site where you can sign up. All right, today's presenter is David Palmer. He is an educational psychologist and director of the Palmer Learning Center in Orange County, California. He is also the author of The Parent's Guide to IQ Testing and Gifted Education, and that link right there will take you directly to his website, and I would encourage all of you to go check it out. There's a lot of interesting information on that site. As I mentioned before, he's also one of our esteemed instructors here at the GATE, or in the GATE program. And I'm going to go ahead, unmute Dave, and pass the ball on to you.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to start by trying to move the slides here. Hold on a minute. So we're going to start with slide number 1, which says slide 8 at the bottom here. I'm going to skip around a little bit in the presentation. I'm going to go back and forth, so just bear with me. If there are any questions as we go through the slides, go ahead and type them in to your Q&A box there, and I'll try to address questions as we go along. And that also helps me understand, if I'm missing something or if you need some clarification. So we'll start with this big concept here, IQ and intelligence. How do they interrelate? And a lot of what we're going to do tonight, everything actually, is, again, some big ideas, some big topics that we're going to hit a small portion of each one. So IQ and intelligence, those are controversial constructs. And IQ, of course, isn't synonymous with intelligence. IQ simply means intelligent quotient, and it's really an outdated term because when IQ tests were originally developed in the 1920s, what they had was it's called a ratio IQ score, where they would take a mental age and divide that by a chronological age and come up with a quotient. And so that's where the term IQ came from, intelligent quotient. But modern IQ tests, since the 70s, doesn't use the quotient anymore. It uses what are called standard scores. So IQ really doesn't have anything to do with the kind of scores we look at right now in IQ tests. But again, it's become associated with the word intelligence and with these tests that we give to look at underlying reasoning ability. And And the question of what is intelligence, again, that's a big question, and everyone that's listening here probably is familiar with multiple intelligence theory and factor theories of intelligence. The simple answer is there is no answer to that question, what is intelligence, because that can mean a lot of different things. There's social intelligence, which some people might argue is the most important type of intelligence or ability, how to get along with other people, how to understand yourself, how to move around in the world and get your needs met and help other people and get along with other people. There's what you can call moral intelligence and a lot of other different areas that we can think of as intelligence. Gardner's areas include like artistic ability and athletic ability and other important constructs or ideas that really aren't measured at all by IQ test. So IQ tests do measure some forms of ability or intelligence, and they're mostly reasoning skills. And by reasoning skills, they're mostly a certain type of reasoning skills, verbal and perceptual, or some people would say verbal and math-oriented skills. We're going to move on to the next slide. IQ testing has been around for, well, actually not too long, since about the 1920s or so. Hasn't been popular for more than 80 years, 80, 90 years. Before that, we had different ways of measuring ability, but it wasn't formalized. IQ testing, it's something that it's still around. We still use it, and it's still pretty prevalent, even though it's controversial, because it does serve a purpose, although it certainly is a limited instrument. It's kind of a crude instrument, a crude way of measuring something that's hard to get at, which is typically reasoning ability. So some of the limitations of IQ testing include what we talked about before. It's a very narrow range of abilities that are considered. Basically, verbal reasoning skills and math skills. The ability to reason with words and the ability to reason with pictures, to figure out picture concepts and understand and explain verbal concepts. Another limitation is test error. Every test, including IQ tests, has error. So that error could be attributed to the tester, the person giving the test, or the person taking the test, the student or the adult or child sitting across the table may not be feeling well that day, for example. So when we give an IQ test, we get a number. That number is not always perfect. There's always some error in the test, and the examiner that gives the test should recognize that and explain that error to the person they're giving the test to. But there are some benefits to IQ testing, and that's why these tests are still around. It does help to identify certain types of learners that need special programming that may not be widely available to most students in school. Some kids that are gifted, in fact, many, do not come across as being academically gifted in the classroom for many different reasons. Some kids that are intellectually gifted that can think very quickly and solve very abstract problems quickly do not do well in the classroom because they kind of tune out, or they're just not good with paper and pencil tasks. Also, some kids are high achievers, kids that do very well, kind of school-oriented kids that do well in the classroom, but are not necessarily kids that learn very quickly and need a different type of instruction. They do very well with kind of sitting in a regular classroom with sequential instruction, and they enjoy school and they perform well and they get high grades, but they don't necessarily need or benefit from a lot of higher level kind of differentiation. I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Okay, so what do IQ tests measure? They measure, again, just a few things. Most IQ tests measure the top two things in this slide: verbal reasoning and perceptual reasoning. Perceptual reasoning is also called, oops, my slide moved here, spatial reasoning, or sometimes nonverbal reasoning. So verbal reasoning, an example of that would be comparing how two concepts or ideas or things are alike and how they're different. That's my son playing the piano in the background. I don't know if you can hear it. I don't want to get up and tell him to stop because I'd have to put my phone down. Explaining abstract concepts, answering higher level comprehension questions, those kind of tasks tie into verbal reasoning. And those are the kind of things that are often part of an IQ test. Perceptual reasoning are the kind of tests you see on the internet if you go to an internet IQ test, which are usually not standardized but kind of just game-like activities where you see picture puzzles. That's an example of spatial reasoning. Memory, the ability to remember something and do something with it and say it back or solve a problem with it, and processing speed, the speed of thinking, basically. Those are 4 areas that are measured on most standard modern IQ tests, including like the WISC-4 and the Stanford Binet 5. I'm going to do a quick memory test, and this is not from an actual IQ test, but it's a type of memory test that's similar to what you might find on an IQ test. This memory component, the third one down here on the slide, on slide number 10, the newer revisions of the modern test, including again the WISC-4, which is the newest revision of the Wechsler test, looks at something called working memory. That's kind of every few years, the test manufacturers look at different scientific theories and revise their test according to different ideas at the time about what intelligence is. And this is all based on something called factor analysis. And the newer tests are emphasizing more this thing called working memory. Whereas previous versions of IQ test, the WISC-3, for example, the previous version of the WISC-4, looked more at what might just be called short-term memory. So an example of short-term memory is, and again, this isn't an actual test, but an example of something that might be similar to what would be on one of these tests. If I said, for example, I'm going to say, we'll start with something hard. IQ tests typically you start with something very easy, and then you get a little bit harder, and it gets a little bit harder, and then you stop the test when the person that's taken the test misses so many in a row. That's called a ceiling. But we're going to start with something hard. I'm just going to do a few of these memory tests so that participants can do this at home and kind of get a sense of what at least this one aspect of an IQ test is. I'm going to say the names of some fruits and vegetables, and when I'm done, you're not supposed to write these down, so just remember them. When I'm done, you just repeat them back or write them down at home if you have a pencil. All right, here we go. When I'm done saying these, you just repeat them back or write them down. Apple, pear, carrot, banana, broccoli, celery, apricot. And what I said was, and you can check if you jotted these down, this is what you should have: apple, pear, carrot, banana, broccoli, celery, and apricot. So most adults, most people over 15, 16 or so, can remember 7 pieces of information like that, 6 or 7 pieces of information. That's an example of what might be called short-term memory. There are a lot of different words for different types of memory, but just basic or simple short-term memory. But the newer IQ test, based on different factor theories, look more at working memory. So for example, this time I'm going to say some names of fruits and vegetables, but no matter what order I say the names of the fruits and vegetables, when I finish, you say, or you can write down, the names of all the fruits I mentioned first, and then the names of all the vegetables I mentioned. For example, if I said lettuce, radish, plum, you would say plum, radish, and lettuce, or plum, lettuce, and radish. Okay, we're going to do one of those. So I'm going to say again a group of fruits and vegetables. When I'm done saying them, you can repeat back or write down the fruits, all the fruits first, and then all the vegetables. Here we go. And don't look at your previous notes, because I'm going to say the same fruits and vegetables. Apple, pear, carrot, banana, broccoli, celery, apricot. And if you did that right, then you would have put all the fruits first, and that would be apple, banana, apricot, pear in any order, and then broccoli, celery, and carrot. So you can see that's not just listening to something and repeating it back, but listening to something, getting it into what might be called short-term memory or working memory, which is this new construct. Doing something with it, which is organizing it, and then repeating it back. So you're not only repeating back what you hear, but you're taking something into short-term memory. You're doing something with it or solving a problem. You're using that information in your memory to do something. Now, another step could be, and I won't do this, but I could say the same series of fruits and vegetables, and then I could ask you to put all the fruits first and put those fruits in alphabetical order, and then all the vegetables next and put those vegetables in alphabetical order. So you can see you would have to hold those in your mind, group all the fruits, think about the alphabetical order, and then the vegetables the same way. So you'd have apple, apricot, banana, pear, broccoli, carrot, and celery, which is really hard to do. So you could, maybe I should take a poll and see how people did, but I'm looking at my notes here. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So what do IQ scores mean? I moved on to slide 11, but what I'm going to do is just kind of fast forward here to slide 17. I'll try to keep it on there. Slide 17. And that's a normal curve. We've all seen those. It's called a bell curve or a normal curve. And basically a normal curve can be considered like a law of nature. For example, people's heights fall on this curve. So if you put along the vertical axis heights of people, number of people, and the horizontal heights, and then you had an average height right in the middle, you would see, like if an average height was 5'8", for example, of males in the United States, right in the middle would be 5'8", and you'd see the hump goes up because most people are average. By definition, most people are average. So you have a lot of people that are 5'8" or around there, and as you get farther away from 5'8", you have fewer and fewer people that are progressively shorter or taller than that. You have some very, very tall people way over on the right-hand side, but not very many. And then you have some very, very short people on the left-hand side, but fewer and fewer as you get shorter and shorter. So physical things like height and weight follow this pattern. And again, why is that true? It's kind of a law of nature. So most things, or many things, I guess you can say, follow this pattern, as do test scores. So reading scores, math scores, and scores on these IQ tests follow this pattern. So when test manufacturers standardize these IQ tests, they manipulate the numbers so that the scores that you get, the scores that are called standard scores, and this is all explained, you can see there on the left-hand side of the curve there, fall into this pattern. They try to fit the scores to this pattern as much as possible. It's not a perfect fit, but it's a pretty good fit. So most people that take a standardized test like an IQ test get a standard score of 100 because most educational tests and IQ tests are designed to have a mean or an average score of 100. 100 right in the middle. Half of the people do better than that. Half do not as good as that. So have a 50% is right at the middle. Most people get around 50%, you can see. So, and this normal curve, the way it's broken down, about 68% get between 85 and 115. So if you have between 85 and 115, that can be considered an average score. As you go out farther to the left, for example, fewer and fewer people get a score of 75 or 70 or 55. If you go to the right, it's symmetrical. In theory, it's symmetrical, and it fits the theory pretty well, but not perfectly. As you go to the right, fewer people get 115. Only about 13, 14%, 16%, I should say, and about 2% get 130. 2 out of 100 get 130, and less than 1% get 145 or above. So that's the way IQ scores are looked at, and that's the way most standard scores in any educational test where the test is set with a mean or average score of 100, and a standard deviation is called a 15. I want to go back to the previous slide. So what do IQ scores mean? All right, most people, the standard score, the bell curve we just looked at was broken down into standard deviations of 15. So 85 to 15 can be considered an average score. Other tables, though, consider a tighter band around 100 to be average. So this is a common way to look at IQ scores. 90 to 109 is in the average range. So about 50% of the population that takes these tests get a score between 90 and 109. And you can see a high average, so about 16% get between 110 and 119. About 6-7% get 120 to 129. About 2% get 130 or above. And then if you go down the other way, you can see that that same pattern still applies. Okay, I'm looking at some of the questions here, and I'll pick a few. Yeah, one question briefly says, are we talking about standard error of measurement? When I mentioned that tests have error, yes. Standard error of measurement is something that you need to know about when you give these tests, because test manufacturers recognize that tests have error, and we'll look at that in a few minutes, and that needs to be acknowledged. Another person is asking, can a person learn enough to increase their IQ score over time? The answer to that is everything is nature and nurture. In theory, IQ tests are designed to measure more innate ability, so what you're kind of born with. But in reality, yes, IQ scores, and an IQ score is just how you perform in these tests, can certainly be enhanced or depressed over time given environmental factors. So we're all born with a propensity to have certain talents or abilities. That could be athletic ability or artistic ability or reasoning ability or math ability or writing ability, whatever it is. But then we can suppress that by inactivity or not pursuing it, or we can enhance whatever that ability is, and that includes the ability to do well on IQ test through practice, through experience, that type of thing. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next. This is important to know. When we hear that Einstein had an IQ of whatever it was supposed to be, 180, 200, and people having IQs of 160 or 180, almost certainly you're hearing about what are called, these are ratio IQ scores. And one of the most common tests given before the 1970s was the Stanford-Binet-LM, which some psychologists still use as a supplement to the modern test. The Stanford-Binet-LM used what are called ratio scores, and you were able to get these very, very high scores, sometimes over 200, 220, because they weren't scores that were meant to fit a normal curve. They weren't what are called standard scores. They were, again, mental age divided by chronological age, or a division of those two with another formula thrown in. So those scores that you hear about aren't comparable to modern IQ scores. But again, some people still use the Stanford-Binet-LM to give additional information to understand better, higher levels of IQ. But that's becoming less and less common because new tests, the WISC-4 and the Stanford-Binet-5, have what are called extended norms. So we really don't need to go back to the Stanford-Binet-LM to see, how far someone can go in an IQ test, because we now have what are called extended norms that have been standardized. So we can look at higher levels of IQ. If someone gets over 145, 150, and we want to know, well, how far can they really go, because particularly older kids and kids at the older end of an age range for an IQ test can top out in a test. Well, now we can understand that by looking at these extended norm tables. So these IQ scores are what many people think about when they look at, what IQ scores mean. I refer to this in my current book, and I say that these type of scores you can look at, but you have to use older instruments, and I'm referring to the Stanford-Binet-LM. The modern IQ test, again, the WISC-4 and Stanford-Binet-5 are two examples of the most commonly used IQ tests, but there are several others out there. These are the terms that these are one set of terms that are commonly accepted. There is no universally accepted set of terms to describe IQ score levels, but this is one that is often used, although you can certainly find several other descriptive term categories. So when you hit 130, that's, again, the top 2 percentile, 130 to 137. Most gifted kids, most kids that score in the gifted range, if you consider 130 to be the gifted range, and some people consider 120 to start the gifted range in these modern tests. Outside programs consider 124 or 125. We'll look at that in a few minutes. But most kids in school GATE programs, for example, and most school kids in programs for gifted learners where you have to have an IQ score are going to be in this range, 130, sometimes 125 to 137. When you start getting above 137, that gets harder and harder to do. I'm noticing there's an error here, so that should be 138 to 144 is considered highly gifted, not 138 to 159. So 138 to 154, 138 to 144 is often called the highly gifted range. And then 145 and above, 145 typically to 151, we can call exceptionally gifted, and then 152 and above on the modern test is often called profoundly gifted. But once you hit 145, many people use the term profoundly gifted for 145. So again, there's no universally accepted term for these score ranges. It's true, though, it's very difficult, and my slides keep moving back and forth, so I just got them back to where we were. Very difficult to get over 138, very even more unusual to get over 145, and very rarely do I see anybody get over 152. So even in the population that I work with, and I work with kids that have already been identified by teachers and parents as having special needs and gifted characteristics, very rarely do I find a child that is over 152. Okay, very briefly, we're going to go over two types of IQ tests. The first is a group test. Most schools give the group test. OSAT and the Negley area are two commonly administered tests. They're good tests. You sit down in a classroom. A teacher can give them. They typically 30, 45 minutes. You have different sections. They're highly correlated with the individual test. The group test can miss some gifted kids, particularly kids that are not time conscious or kids that are a bit inattentive. Research has shown, there's a couple links there at the bottom, that they do tend to miss some gifted kids, and some research shows that the more highly gifted a child is when you test them with an individually administered test like the WISC-4 or Stanford MA5, the more likely it is that a group test will not catch that child, so there'll be some false negatives. But given that schools can't give individually administered tests to each child because it takes about 2 hours to administer a test and another couple of hours to do the report, the group tests are a good way to screen. And IQ tests are only one part of the process for assessing for GATE programs in most schools, so they're not the final word. They're just one part of the screening process, one of the criteria that are looked at. Sometimes kids can get a score that's not quite making the cutoff, but they do well on the other criteria the district uses, and each district can use its own criteria, teacher recommendations, for example, or portfolio analysis, or grades, or state test scores, and they might weight those things differently. So sometimes kids don't quite make the IQ cutoff on the group test, but they might do well in the other criteria and therefore be accepted into the GATE program if that's what they like to do. Okay, I want to look at a couple of profiles real fast, and we don't have too much time, so I'm going to go quickly. This is actually I could spend an hour on these things, but I can't do that now here. I'm looking at a couple questions first. Ashley says, so is one standard deviation both ways considered average? Yes, typically that's one way. 85 to 115 is average, but again, some people tighten it up and say 90 to 110 is average. There's no universally accepted way to do that, but it's either 90 to 110 or 85 to 115. Is there a certain age range best for testing IQ? I'm just reading some questions here. I don't test before 4.5 unless there's a real good reason to do that. IQ, reasoning ability, starts firming up around 4.5, and often right before a child enters kindergarten if there is some concern that the child is way ahead of the curve and kindergarten is not going to be a good place for him or her. It's often good to do that then because that's information is real beneficial for educational planning when you're considering, for example, early enrollment or supplementary programs, or you want to bring information to the school to discuss options. So 4.5 is when I start testing. IQ, though, keeps firming up. It appears to 7.5 or 8, and then remains pretty stable for most people, all else being equal. IQ tests you can test all the way down to age 2, but those scores aren't very stable when you're looking at different things. Okay, I'm going to go back to the thing. Okay, so here's a profile of, this person would, all else being equal again, mostly in the average range there, high average range. Not a whole lot of spread between scores. This is like a typical profile of a person that, if you pull from the population pool would look like. There's always relative strengths and weaknesses. All kids and adults have those. And here we have a relative weakness in perceptual reasoning and a relative strength in verbal comprehension. So this person's more verbal than they are perceptual. Not unusual. Working memory is good. Processing speed, everything's pretty balanced there. I'm going to look at another. Trying to go to the next one here. Okay, here's 2 more. So I'm going to look at the top one. Here's a profile. These are actual profiles of a student that was scoring the gifted range. Some quick points. So this is a WISC-4 profile, and if you look at the Stanford Binet 5 or the Kaufman or other tests, you're going to have different sub-skills. When people think of what is an IQ score, most people are thinking of the full scale score, how the person did on the whole test. But actually, that's not the best way to look at it sometimes. Tests are broken into different areas. This test, the WISC-4, the most recent version of the WISC, is broken down into verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning. Those are the 2, you can say, most important parts of the test because they tap into what you might think of as intelligence or reasoning or problem solving. And then the 2 other areas they tap into, working memory and processing speed, are what are called lower level processes. So they're not as correlated with reasoning ability. So I see a lot of kids with very high reasoning ability, verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, and they don't do as well on working memory processing speed. But this person is pretty balanced. Okay, they don't have any huge differences. This person, all else being equal, would be a student that would do really well in school, just looking at this information and not have any major issues. I don't see any flags for learning disability or problem in school. Full scale, if you look at the whole thing together and you look at the score tables for this person's age, because in standard scores you compare the performance to other kids within their age band. 132, so that's the gifted range at 130. Very superior gifted, you can see the qualitative description. The General Ability Index is something that is recommended by the National Association of Gifted Children, and many schools use this in place of the full scale because the General Ability Index just considers the verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning parts of the WISC-4 and doesn't consider the other 2 parts. Those other 2 parts, again, are lower level processes and may be more impacted by attentional issues or fine motor issues. You can see the confidence interval. Somebody asked about the standard error of measurement. So all IQ test manuals will give you confidence intervals. So, for example, we can be relatively sure if we're looking at the General Ability Index, the GAI, of 135, that this is the 95th percentile confidence interval. We can be sure with a 95% degree of confidence that the score that this person would have gotten had there not been any error in the test would be in the range of 129 to 138. That's what that means. If you look below there, you see someone, I see this often, and for some reason, boys much more than girls, and it's true that boys are identified with specific learning disabilities at a much higher rate than girls. Why that is, nobody quite knows, but there's different theories. One is testosterone in gestation does something that creates this issue. But you can see this is interesting, and if you're a teacher of gifted kids, I bet you have these kids in your class, and you might recognize some of these profiles. Highly verbal, very fluid, with understanding concepts, explaining things, very quick, likes to do everything in his head. Verbal comprehension doesn't like to at all look at processing speed. That has to do with partially getting things down on paper quickly. So this is an actual person I tested, and I see this pattern over and over again. Processing speed, there's an issue. Often the higher the IQ, the more difficulty it is. I see a pattern of kids getting things down on paper. They like to do things in their head, but they don't like to write. And sometimes not only do they not like to write, but they actually have a form of what's called dysgraphia. So, you keep working with it, and then eventually they learn how to type or do some other accommodations with them. This might be a profile that indicates there might be a 2E child here, or a twice exceptional child, very bright, gifted intellectually, but has a specific learning issue or disability or processing problem in fine motor functioning or fluency. Okay, I'm going to move on here. Okay, all right, I'm going to go through this quickly. I think I have about 10 minutes here. So what does this mean, these scores for GATE programming or gifted enrichment programming? I'm going to look at that, but first I'm going to answer a couple questions. Second, processing speed. Thank you. Okay. Christy asked, can you explain what constitutes processing speed? Processing speed is supposed to measure something called, well, you can think of it as thinking speed, the ability to solve problems quickly and then react quickly. But the tasks that are trying to tap into that factor on the WISC-4 have kids write things down with a paper and pencil. So sometimes when you see a very low processing speed score, that's very much lower, significantly lower than the other reasoning scores, the verbal or the perceptual reasoning scores, it's not because they have a processing speed problem or a thinking speed problem. Again, it's because of the visual motor disfluency or speed issue. Okay, so if you're looking at this, we're looking at slide 18. An exact average score is 100. Most outside programs don't look for 130. Most school programs do. Not all school programs. School programs can set their own criteria, and they could change them from year to year or more often. There's no federal or state laws pertaining to GATE programming that states how schools need to identify. There are state code of regulation kind of parameters, but there's no federal law like there is special education, so these can be changed. But most outside programs, and I'm going to go over some pretty soon, are looking for an IQ score either in verbal or perceptual or full scale. That equates to the 95th percentile. So that's an IQ score of 124, 125. And again, you don't have to have a full scale or a general ability index score of 124 or 125. You only have to have a score in verbal or perceptual or full scale or general ability index of 124, 125. And that is a myth. There's a great book, which I'll mention. I always recommend it. It's called Gifted Children, Myths and Realities by Ellen Winter. Ellen Winter's married to, or I think she's currently married to, Howard Gardner of the Multiple Intelligences, Harvard fame. Again, Gifted Children, Myths and Realities. And one of the myths is that gifted kids are globally gifted, and that's not true. And again, I see a lot of this in my own practice. You often have kids that are verbally gifted or perceptually gifted, but not in both. They don't have a balanced profile. That's very common. We can talk about left brain, right brain things too, and there are books on that subject as well. But most programs recognize that. That's why they don't require a full scale, but only a verbal or a perceptual or a full scale score, sometimes which is replaced by the general ability index of 124, 125. Most school programs also recognize that and accept either verbal, perceptual, or full scale. Okay, I'm looking now, trying to go to the next slide. Okay, so roughly, what does this mean for educational planning? Most kids that get between 85 and 115 can do well in a regular classroom because that's the way schools are structured. There's always, hopefully, some differentiation, enough to accommodate kids that need a little bit more repetition, a little bit more practice, and then enough differentiation to accommodate those kids that don't need as much repetition or practice, but need more kind of a higher level activities or project-based learning. Cooperative groups or cluster grouping or ability grouping in a regular classroom takes care of most of that. I want to go a little more quickly here. I'm on slide 20. Kids with IQs between 115 and 130 might need some additional accommodation, but not necessarily formal GATE programming. And I list some of those accommodations below there under examples. Somebody just asked me about the title of the book. It's Gifted Children, Myths and Realities by Winner, W-I-N-N-E-R, Gifted Children, Myths and Realities. Okay, so these are the type of things under examples that most good teachers do all the time, but they understand that they have some kids that need more on depth and complexity skill than do others. Some need more repetition and going over things and remediation. Some don't need that, and they need to go more in depth. So those kids between 115 and 130, often, sometimes they're called high achievers, and that's good. They're motivated and they like school and they work for grades, and some of them like pleasing a teacher and see themselves as good in school and perform, and that's where a lot of these kids are, the high achieving group. The next slide, 21. 130 and 145, and again, these are very rough guides. Again, most GATE programs, school GATE programs, just use IQ scores as one part of the selection criteria. There's a lot of other things they look at as well, but roughly kids between 130 and 138 to 145 or so need additional programming that isn't typically available in a regular class, or not as much as they need in a regular class. Multi-age combo classes are often good for these kids because they can work at the higher level of curriculum with older peers. Between class or grade cluster grouping, if you have ability grouping in math or reading, for example, and you have kids that are way outside the norm, you can sometimes ability group them in a grade or two above. They go to a different class for those areas. Most people have heard of the teaching gifted kids in the regular classroom book. Some of those methods of providing more depth and complexity can be used within a regular classroom or a GATE classroom, cluster classroom. Replacement curriculum is where a child is, for example, very precocious in math, and what is going on in the regular classroom isn't as relevant to them as it is to other kids, and they've kind of moved beyond that, and they've tested out of that curriculum already. So some teachers let kids bring in other curriculum from programs like Stanford EPGY or John Hopkins Center for Talented Youth, and do that curriculum within the classroom at the time when other kids are working on the regular math curriculum. Outside GATE programming, a lot of these, all these programs are listed on my website, palmerlearning.com, under the Great Links page. You can go right to these websites. Again, Stanford EPGY, John Hopkins, UCI has a summer program I think most of you know about, and now a Saturday program as well. It's a very popular program for gifted kids. And then Summer Institute for the Gifted, SIG, there's the one, they're housed all over the nation. There's one at UCLA. And then formal GATE programming, so either cluster grouping, full day class, or pull-out programs. Single subject acceleration is where kids, again, if you have a child that is very far advanced in reading, that child might go into a higher grade for reading or writing instruction or for math instruction if they're not able to accommodate that child in that in their own classroom or within their own grade level. And the grade skip. Now, grade skipping is controversial, and but it does work very well for some kids, particularly if it's only about a year. If the kids are going to be no more than a year younger than most of the kids of the grade they're being put into. And go to that website there if you haven't been there yet, and there's a lot of research on grade skipping and other forms of acceleration. accelerationinstitute.org/nationdeceived. I want to go quickly here. IQs of 145 and above, these kids almost always need some sort of acceleration, and I'm going to let you look at that there. Davidson Young Scholars has a program where you have to have a 145 or above and have to have a similar score in an academic area. There are special schools, there are magnet schools, there are special programs. I've listed some of them there. Some kids, very few, one out of several thousand or tens of thousands, benefit from like CSLA, Cal State Los Angeles, has an early entrance program. Kids as young as 11, but typically 13, 14 can enroll, can skip high school basically and do high school and college and get out of college at 18 with a 4-year degree. They're clustered with other kids like them, so it's like a high school experience on a college campus. So there are some more radical things out there that you can try. Parents can try if some of these other lower level interventions don't work or are not working. Okay, I'm going to go over a few of these things. Okay, I'm going to look at some questions first. Debbie is asking, how would you use a replacement curriculum in the classroom, and don't you need to teach it to them? No, you don't need to teach it to them. If you did, then you shouldn't be using a replacement curriculum, because with replacement curriculum, for example, if they're enrolled in the Stanford EPGY program, and let's say it's math, so you have a very precocious fourth grader, let's say, that's already doing geometry, and he tests out of your grade level curriculum, and you just aren't going to be teaching your fourth graders geometry, but that's where he is, and that's what he's been doing at Stanford EPGY or another one of these programs. You can let him take his materials and work in your classroom if you have study areas, or in another classroom, or in the media center on this curriculum from Stanford EPGY. You don't have to know the curriculum because it's a replacement curriculum. He or she is responsible for getting the instruction from the other, again, the Stanford EPGY instructor or whoever they're working with. Parents, the more radical the accommodation, the more parent involvement there is. So no, the teacher isn't responsible for that replacement curriculum, but they are responsible for making sure that the child has tested out of the school's curriculum first, that they've already mastered that. They're responsible for seeing that the child has already knows what that teacher was going to teach that year before they consider using a replacement curriculum. Is this an online program, Debbie is asking? Yes, it's an online program, but you have access to a mentor teacher via online and phone, and some of these programs have actual meetings where you meet with other students. Okay. All right, so I want to hit a few of these and we'll have questions. Pushy parents, I rarely find those. Most parents that come to me for testing are not wanting their kids to be gifted and get into programs because their neighbor got into it. But they're concerned because their child is tuning out or turning off to school because, again, you might have a kindergartner or someone entering kinder that's already reading at a fourth grade level, or someone that's way out of sync, not because the parents have been pushing them and tutoring them and using flashcards. It's because their brain is geared that way and they're absorbing all this information on their own, and they're wanting to, if they're school-oriented, read and do math and think and write. And so putting the child in with grade or age-level peers sometimes can have negative social consequences, and also, that boy or girl it's difficult for the teacher to accommodate them, and sometimes they can shut down and have a negative attitude, and that could have long-lasting implications. Social first, I always say you should always consider social aspects first, but that doesn't always mean putting a child in with kids that are within 6 months of their age. Most gifted kids gravitate toward older kids and adults for conversation and feel more. They make more connections that way. So if we're talking radical acceleration, more than a year, that really needs to be considered carefully. But if it's 6 months, a year or so, that's not really a big deal. If you look at, for example, a grade skip and you have the evidence, there's something called the Iowa scale that some schools use. If you have the IQ evidence, the achievement evidence, out-of-level testing, where you're comparing academic scores to academic performance on a test to kids in that child's current grade, and then comparing their performance to kids in 1 or 2 grade levels above them, and they're doing quite well. That's more evidence that, hey, this is not a good match to grade level, so a grade skip should be considered. Again, go to anationdeceive.com and look at the research on that. Think about the end goal. Life isn't a race, and school isn't a race. It's not, gifted programming is not about getting somewhere faster and farther, but matching the needs of the student right now. So making school a place 6 hours a day where they're getting some challenge and some engagement right now so they don't turn off to the process of learning. I tell parents, again, you don't need to push or go as far as you can go, but you should always, if you have a child that thinks like this and gravitates towards other kids that think like this, provide some what I call mental mate time at least part of the year. See if they like that, if they like being with other kids that have higher level reasoning skills and engaging them in conversation. And if they do, try more of that. If that's not a big deal to them, then you don't have to do as much of that. Walls to climb, so some of these kids can sail through school, get straight A's, and never have to do anything. So occasionally give them a curriculum that's challenging for them. So most of the time you can get that in the regular school. Sometimes you have to go to these outside programs. So they know what it feels like to be challenged, at least occasionally. And that could even be with an artistic thing or a sports thing or a music thing. It doesn't have to be academics. When you're talking about acceleration, for example, and other accommodations, make it database, because schools, understandably, they don't want to want something for one child and not for the next just because the parent's asking for it. But if you have more evidence, information that you can bring to school in a collaborative way, that usually works best. Don't get stuck in that question, gee, if we do fourth grade curriculum in third grade, what are we going to do next year? You can cross that bridge when you come to it. There are things you can do. Again, more replacement curriculum. Take a year where you're not focusing on that subject and focusing on something else, but don't always get stuck in that question. Explore, visit, talk to other parents, go online. If you have an idea, try it, give it some time, be flexible, and you can change if it doesn't work. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to ask Angela to come back on and
yes, great. Thank you so much, Dave. We've got about 6 minutes to go through some of these other questions. And one of them was, let me see here. In your opinion, Dave, can California's GATE program be effective for a child with a 145 IQ and higher?
And if you ask that question to someone else, you'll probably get a different answer. But you say California's GATE program, so there is no California GATE program. It's different from district to district and school to school and teacher to teacher. And sometimes you can get a teacher that's not a GATE teacher in a regular classroom that knows how to differentiate, and you got a wonderful program there, and they can meet the needs of someone with a 145 IQ. The 145 IQ is just one aspect of that student, so you can have 10 different kids with a 145 IQ, be that verbal, perceptual, general ability index, full scale, and have 10 different personalities and 10 different orientations towards school. Some of those kids might be very school-oriented and very much into just intellectual reasoning and just love school and love science or love math or whatever it is. They're very hard to accommodate unless you have these outside programs. Other kids, they enjoy the social aspect of school, the structure of school. They enjoy their teachers and enjoy making the teachers happy and hanging around other kids their age or a little bit older. And then, yes, it's easier to accommodate. Some other psychologists look at the scores and prescribe, there's 145, so you should do A, B, and C. But again, I look at the scores and say, here's some things you can try. Try it. If it feels right, see if it works. If it doesn't, try something else. But at least try the mental mate time and give them a challenging curriculum part of the time. So yes, my answer is yes, it can much of the time. If you get way out there in the curve, above 145, it becomes more difficult often. Some kids, though, that are gifted or have these kind of scores can self-stimulate some metacognitive skills. They're going to be reading books all the time. They're going to be going home, going to the internet, and they're going to be thinking about things in their head when you're lecturing in class, and they're going to be entertaining themselves and moving on at their own pace regardless of what you do. So, again, I guess my answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Okay. Another question was, can we train kids to take IQ tests? And if yes, would you mention books or reference material?
Yeah, in theory, we're not supposed to train kids to take IQ tests because what's the point? So IQ tests are supposed to identify kids that need a special type of, or may need a special type of curriculum and learn differently. Can you train somebody? Yeah, you can get a manual and go over all the sub-tests and train them and coach them, and they probably get a really good score. Most examiners would see that right away, that they've been coached, though. Can you train them? If the question means can you improve your IQ score on these tests by doing certain activities, yes, but those activities don't necessarily have to be book activities like doing puzzles and such. It's just any type of enrichment activities where you let the child explore what they're interested in doing and give them a lot of different types of experiences and expose them to higher level language and words and that type of thing. But you can't coach higher level reasoning too much. You can bump it up a little bit or down a little bit, but most of what is tested on the reasoning portion of these tests is innate. But you can prove it a little bit or suppress it a little bit depending on experiences.
Great. Another question, Dave, was for schools that use or that test only perceptual reasoning, are they failing to identify truly gifted students who are not gifted spatially?
I'm sorry. That schools that test only what?
I guess if you're familiar with school, or if there are schools that test only or test students using only perceptual reasoning or test only perceptual reasoning, are those schools doing a disservice and not failing?
Well, Yeah, I understand the question now. So,
Okay.
the thing that's most highly correlated with school achievement is the verbal section of IQ test, because school is mostly verbal, so you're hearing things and saying things and writing things and reading things. So, yeah, you're missing some kids, that's true, but schools that only give the Naglieri, for example, which is a perceptual, spatial, nonverbal group test, and have to do that or give some form of group test because, again, it's impossible to give everyone a comprehensive test. They're catching a lot of kids that are going to benefit from these programs. They might be missing a few, but these schools are going to have other criteria. They look at teacher recommendation, CTS scores, the California State test scores, and they're going to be looking at the verbal section of that. So that's going to catch some of these kids that are verbally gifted. So if they only used a perceptual test and that's the only criteria, they would miss a lot of kids. But because schools have usually 4 or 5 or 6 or more different criteria, and the final decision is made by a group familiar with the child, including the parent often, hopefully they'll miss fewer that way.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question, then we're going to wrap it up. Dave, how do you test a second language learner or a non-English speaker?
Well, you can't do a valid verbal test on a non-English speaker, of course, with an English-speaking, an English IQ test. So what you do, it depends on their language level. I've tested kids that are second language learners. One boy recently from Japan, but he spoke, his English was pretty good, but it was definitely a second language. So you do the verbal section, but you, in your report, you flag that, of course, and this boy happened to do very well on the verbal portion, even though he was a second language learner. But you either don't do the verbal section or you just note that, and you know that this is only a baseline test. You're just looking at it to see, what's going on now, what might happen in a year or two if it's tested again. But you use mostly perceptual test, nonverbal test, or maybe just the nonverbal section of a comprehensive test, like the perceptual reasoning section of the WISC 4, and then maybe the working memory or the processing speed. But mostly the perceptual sections of comprehensive test, or like the Naglieri, a spatial IQ test.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this for this hour and volunteering your time. There was a lot of great information. I do want to respect everyone's time, so we are complete with the hour. And I'm going to go ahead and close the presentation down. But if you have any pressing questions, please feel free to email me at that email provided right there on the screen, AYN as in Nancy, GEL M as in Mary O @uci.edu, and I will make sure to either get that question answered by Dave if he's willing, or to find out the information for you myself. And thank you again, Dave.
Thank you, Amanda.
Have a great rest of the night.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.